Good morning. If you can get a cup of coffee and find a seat, we're waiting for our clergy to finish shaking hands. No rush. No rush. Everybody, take your time. It's cold.
What are you going to ask me?
So as we gather, I will welcome anybody who is watching from home and assure you that we are going to get started in a minute. Everybody's pretty excited about being back in the church. And as you know, today we are celebrating the Feast of the Holy Cross. Would you like to say something? Would you like to say hello?
What's that?
That's on Microsoft. You say hello.
Hello. Hello.
Hello. Hello, everyone. So today is the feast day of the Chapel of the Cross. That's why the altar cloths are red. We had to talk about that a lot in Children's Chapel. I'll preface this by saying that last week in Children's Chapel, a child said to me, "Why do we talk so much about God in here?" And I said, well, the reason is because we all come together to worship God together. And he said, that was not a satisfactory answer. So today I said, Luca, I have revised my answer. We talk about God so much to remind each other that we are part of God's story. And we come together to encourage each other to follow the cross and to follow Jesus' teachings. And he said, yeah, okay. So I'm coming in here feeling pretty good. But following the cross is not always easy. It is not always comfortable. Living fully into God's story can be difficult. And so we wanted to start this program year by asking our clergy, some of whom you may recognize, some you may not. We'll let each introduce themselves as we go through, to talk about what discipleship, following the cross, living fully into God's story means to them. We will have time for some questions and comments from all of you if you want to share. But I'm going to start with Mary Cat because she has to run out to help the campus ministry. Acolytes.
Good morning. Mary Cat Young, you may recognize me from before my sabbatical. I've been here about 5 years. I'm thrilled to be back from sabbatical and with you all. And what I like about invitations to share what is our place in God's story and how do we connect to all of this is memory from my youth. And it's what I like to call my Zacchaeus moment. And Zacchaeus is a story in Scripture where this person climbs up a sycamore tree because the crowds are so thick around Jesus. And Jesus says, "Hey, you in the sycamore tree, come here. We got something to talk about. We got stuff to do." And they go and have an experience. And as a young person, I grew up going to the Episcopal Church. I had a wonderful experience learning to become an acolyte. But there were things happening in my world that were not always visible to folks on Sunday morning. And there was a time over summertime when a member of the parish staff, the youth minister, said, "Hey, let's go get coffee. Let's go have a conversation." We didn't get coffee. It was 7th grade. But let's meet up this summer and have a conversation. And it was clear to me in that moment that I was seen as a part of that community that was trying to learn about Jesus, but also that was seen and present and valued and had needs to be cared for, as well as something to offer. And in my vocational life, part of what that led to was invitations to continue being involved in different leadership aspects of church. And you wouldn't know this, but I was pretty shy, young person, and learned who I could be and always felt that I was the one being called into church and community and Christ's body, not the person I would experience at school, right, who kind of had to put up a lot of barriers and a lot of protection and a lot of like, oh, this is very awkward, versus at church, it always felt like I was being invited as me to come into that space and that I had things to offer and things to learn. So I'm really thankful for that. And over time, that has led to a lifelong vocation, not only of being a leader in church, but also as someone who gets to see people who are in the sycamore tree trying to get a glimpse or an understanding of Jesus and say, hey, come on, let's go learn about this together. And I get to do a lot of that in discipling young adults, but also across the generations, because we share in that care for all ages in our community. So I'm grateful for that.
Good morning. I'm Keith Esposito. I serve as the associate rector here. I, like Mary Kat, will also be cutting out to make sure that everything's good for the 11:15 service, so please forgive us for that. In preparation for today, I've been thinking specifically about the question of what does it mean for me to follow the cross, right? Follow in the way of the cross, follow Jesus to the cross, carry my own cross. I am not a cradle Episcopalian. I found my way to this denomination as an adult. And in the church and the community I came from, the kind of theology around this that I think I heard most often, or at least that I kind of absorbed, was kind of like what it means to follow the cross is to suffer, and that like we are called to suffer like Christ. Now, I think there's some truth in that, but I think it also led me to a place where sometimes I thought like, oh, if I feel bad about something, that means I should do it. Or do you know what I mean? Like, or that I'm only following Jesus if there's like pain, or if there's this like very heavy sense of sacrifice. Now, following Jesus means doing hard things, that's for sure. But I think I'll speak for myself, but I think I've heard this is true for others, is you also find yourself in a place where like you feel like denying who you are or denying yourself means like that's a good thing. And then you get to a weird place like where you can't trust your own kind of reactions to things at times, whether it's mental or your feelings or whatever it is. And as an adult, I have gotten a lot of solace and a lot of growth of my faith life through some aspects of Ignatian spirituality, St. Ignatius, who founded the Jesuits. And one of the key concepts in Ignatian spirituality is this idea of consolation and desolation. Consolation is a feeling or an awareness of God's presence with you. And desolation is the opposite, is like feeling God's absence. Now, sometimes this gets framed as highs and lows, like what was your happiest time of day and what was your saddest. But that's not quite right. It's about when are you just aware of God's presence, or when do you feel close? When is it just there? And when are times in the day where like maybe you have to like cultivate it or try, or you can't kind of get to that same kind of place of connection. And as I've leaned into that, and there's this thing called the Examen, where you live your day and then you reflect on it and you note moments of consolation and desolation. Something interesting happened for me, and I found it's true for others, is yes, you find consolation in happy moments, like with friends and family and joy, But you also sometimes feel consolation in moments that other people would find very hard or that are objectively sad scenarios. So for example, when I was discerning the priesthood, when I found myself in pastoral conversations having to comfort a family in the midst of loss, or walking into a hospital room as a chaplain for someone who just got a terrible diagnosis, when I would think about those days, those were moments where I was hyper aware of God's presence. And that then has, I think, reshifted how I think about following the cross is, we are all called by God to lean into the hard parts of life, the tough things, the things that we are called also to serve others in those moments. And for me, thinking about those moments of consolation in the midst of trouble or in the midst of difficulty are the ways in which I think I try to follow in the way of the cross most presently, day to day. I hope that made sense. Okay.
Hi, I'm the Reverend Dr. Karen Connor McGugan. I'm the curate for youth and families, and I have been here for just over a year. And when I was reflecting on what I wanted to say today, it sort of occurred to me that there are really 3 theologians that I think encompass the way that I understand what it means to follow the cross. And they are Kate Bowler at Duke, the Reverend Dr. James Cone, and Julian of Norwich. So Kate Bowler, many of you have probably heard of her, and she writes a lot about this sort of relentless positivity, this good vibes only thing that defines our society and so often our faith. And she talks about how our need to deny the ubiquitousness and the reality and inevitability of suffering and death shapes our understanding of God and our understanding of the cross, which, we also often see in art or jewelry and in our churches as this beautiful, inspiring thing. And I think it's important for us to do the work of desituating that. Thank you. And resituating the cross in its historical context, where it was an instrument of terror, an instrument of execution by the state. And it was something that was meant to communicate to the lower class people that were victimized by it, that you are worthless, that you should not try to resist the oppression that is being put upon you. And so I think that when we resituate the cross in this way, then the question becomes, what does it mean that Jesus dies on a cross? And so as Christians, we believe that Jesus is God's self-revelation, that Jesus' life and death tell us everything we need to know about who God is. And so the fact that Jesus dies on a cross tells us that this is the place that God is willing to go, this place of terror and shame, out of love for us, and that God is willing to be present with us there. And so the fact that God goes to this very worst place means that in our worst places, God is present with us too, and some connection with God is possible. And so in moments when I feel hopeless in my own life or hopeless about a situation in the world, the reality of God's presence of the cross is there for me and pushes back against this sort of positivity that can prevent us from trying to show up for one another in these really hard places, because God's presence there calls us to be present there too. So relatedly, the work of Reverend Dr. James Cone in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, draws this incredibly powerful parallel between the Roman practice of crucifixion and our country's history of lynching Black people. And Cone points out that both of these practices are practices that are rooted in this sense of terror and shame and this idea that there are people who don't matter. But the fact that Jesus dies on a cross flips this message on its head. It moves the margins to the center and locates Jesus with the oppressed. And so it calls us to locate ourselves there too. And so I think that for me, following the cross also requires this sort of continual commitment to interrogate my own privilege. And it does that for all of us too, whatever it is that our particular privilege looks like. And then the last thing I'll say about deciding to follow the cross comes from Julian of Norwich, the 14th century mystic, who has this very long and graphic vision of the crucifixion while she's on what she thinks is her deathbed, although she actually doesn't die. But her ultimate takeaway from that vision is love, that the cross is like this inflection point, the singular point at which God's all-loving nature is fully realized. And so following the cross means trying to reflect this love in all the ways that I just talked about, in being bravely present with one another when things are really hard. It means interrogating our privilege. And it also means that this sort of love needs to be reflected in how we relate to ourselves. So this means knowing that we are beloved children of God just as we are, and that our worth isn't determined by anything that we do or anything that we fail to do. And so I think that our sort of current, desperately polarized and productivity-based culture doesn't really encourage us to do all these things. And yet, the irony in all of this is that in following the cross, this instrument of death, it really is our way of life.
Turn around a little bit. I am the Reverend Dr. Mary Beth Humphrey. I go by Beth. And I am a retired school chaplain, now living in Chapel Hill. I also went to grad school in Chapel Hill back in the 70s, and it was not in anything related to the Episcopal Church. It was chemistry. So I was here and I got a degree in chemistry, and for years I worshiped the God of science and rationality, and everything should make sense and you can measure it. And then life happened. And I went to places in my life that were sad, that were lonely, and in the midst of it all, I found God was there. So, and I also discovered, and I did that by discovering the Episcopal Church, because I was raised in the southern, how shall I put it? A different tradition, a very literal tradition. So I worshiped the God of science for a while, and then reached a point in my life where there was nothing that science could do for me. And I learned that lying in bed where I had to stay for many months, that I could find that God was there. I was not alone. And then I discovered the Episcopal Church. And I said, this is great. You don't have to leave your brain at the door. And God is more than we can put into a very compact testimony. So that's my story. I wanted to share it with others, so I went to seminary. And I spent most of all of my career in school chaplaincy at St. Albans School in the district, and then and part of it at a boarding school in Massachusetts. So I've worked with kids. I was the chaplain to 4th through 8th grade boys. So no one can ask me a question that takes me off guard now. So enough about me. Let's talk about the cross and following the cross. And excuse me if it's a little not literal, but imaginative, because that's how I've taught. one of the things that the cross symbolizes to me, not only the sacrifice of Jesus and the conquering of death and the pain that we all go through in life. Sometimes I look at the cross as a symbol of where we are. We are in the middle of the cross, reaching down to God as who supports us, reaching up to what we can do, and reaching towards each other, embracing each other in the arms of the cross. And the other thing in this talk is about following Jesus. And I look at my young grandchildren and I say, that's what we're doing. We try to do things maybe we're not ready to do. We trip over things we don't see. We fall down. We accomplish some things, but we never stop trying because we have someplace to go. We don't know where it is, but we got to keep moving.
Thank you, Beth. I'm Elizabeth Marie Melchona. I serve as rector of the parish. I've been here 8 years now. I feel like, in a way, like I just preached on this, so I neither want to repeat myself, nor do I wish to spoil the surprise for someone who hasn't been to the 11:15 yet. But I think when Father Keith was talking about the Ignatian practices of consolation and desolation, those were practices that really, that I use in my own spiritual practice. And I think that that act of attentiveness to, and then trying to align with where you sensed God's presence, and just as importantly, what was not life-giving, what was death-dealing, where was there an absence, what was not aligned with God or with kingdom values. Like, recognizing those matters. It matters for how we're able to show up as full embodied creatures of God. I referenced just ever so briefly in my sermon, but I recently had a really close friend die. And again, what Keith was saying about showing up in the midst of sadness, that there being a real presence of God there. And as I spoke and reflected at a gathering that we held for her, I thought about Lazarus and the way that Jesus wept at the tomb of his friend, and also the way in which Jesus continues to call us out into new life, and Lazarus, come out, unbind him. And so I think that's part of orienting your life as a disciple of Jesus, means that you eschew some things that might be binding you, that might be very attractive, that might be what everyone else is doing. But there's this balance of saying no so that you can say yes deeply. And I think part of what, at least my experience over this past weekend with my friend's death reminded me, was how important it is that as disciples of Jesus, we're authentic with one another, because there was no way I could say, I'm fine, everything's great. But that's my, that's like the first place I want to go because I want to be encouraging to folks. And I experienced the gift of both vulnerability and others' vulnerability in grieving this death. Not that it's done, but I came away from that with, again, if you heard me preach, a sense of awe of like, oh, we get to really show up to one another. And I think as your priest, the invitation that I feel as a disciple of Jesus right now is how do we show up authentically for one another? Like, how are we really real about the things that are real and joyful and hard? Because God's in the midst of them.
Thank you. We are, oh, I surprised you.
Yes.
Huh?
I was getting ready to hand
We're going to have a chance to pass the mic and ask questions and make comments. I wanted to say two things. We've got a small group reading Miroslav Volf's book. Miroslav Volf was actually one of Elizabeth Marie's professors at Yale, and it's called A Public Faith. And so we've been talking about what it means to be a public Christian, a public person of faith during times when, to sort of quote him, some people use the words of Christianity as a battle cry, and some people feel like those words should never be mentioned in polite society. So how do we live as people of faith publicly? A lot of what I hear you talking about, though, is a private faith, and quite a few people mentioned moments of desolation, of sadness, of suffering, when God felt very present. So my first question, because I have the mic, is what do you do when you don't feel that? What do you do when it's dark and you profess to be a person of faith and you don't feel God's presence?
I would also say we're not the only ones who can answer. Someone else can also raise their hand.
Yes, yes.
But I feel like that's when that turning toward another and being able to name before a fellow disciple of Jesus, like, I'm struggling, I hurt, whatever it is, that's one of the gifts of being in community with one another, because you're not always going to have that affective, that feeling. But there are times where the prayers that we pray, you're carried by another's sense. Yeah.
I can just say quickly that the only time in my life during which I have not been a regular in church was in the 18 months or so after my father died. It was a real time of desolation for me, and one in which, in the moment, I did not feel that God was present. And even though I wasn't active in a faith community during that time, there was another graduate student that lived in my neighborhood, and she asked every single week if I wanted to take a walk along the Charles River and just talk. And we did. And I don't know how I would have made it through that period without her. And looking back, I realized that, like, those walks were church for me, and that Julie was God's presence during that time. And I think that those walks with Julie, in retrospect, were a big part of my discernment and my call that I eventually recognized to the priesthood. So I think that if even in these moments, if God doesn't feel present in the ways that we might hope or expect, God is still always working, making a way where there is no way, even if it's not what we might think.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments now that I've put something uncomfortable out there? Yes. Yes, and boy, are we uncomfortable in here. I'm sorry it's so cold. Chris, we did not invite you to speak, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but Chris Redmond, our intern from Duke, is here, so feel free. You could pose a question, too.
No pressure.
Question over there. Mary's got one.
Thank you. Well, I was just thinking of a time in my life when I was having some ailments, and I think what came to my mind was the crucifixion, and I said, well, look at Jesus on the cross and what he went through. What are you complaining about? And I know somehow having that thought was just a big help. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary.
So I'm in the book group with Boykin in the public faith, and one of the things that we talked about last week was that people were nervous about wearing the cross. Some people, it was a statement and felt like they're very comfortable, and I'm really glad I'm beside somebody who's wearing the cross right now. But because there's so many people react, they're different faiths, different parts of Christianity, and so I've sort of been thinking about this week of like what it does mean personally to be. I'm not ready to wear the cross on my, but what that means, and how to have conversations whose beliefs are different, Christianities are different than mine, different parts of it. So anyway, I think it's a great opportunity to be open about that. So, thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
My congregation was full of Muslims, Jewish people, boys of all kinds of religions, all kinds of Christianities. And so I faced the challenge of how to make it Christian and yet encompassing. So it was a little synchronistic, syncretic, I guess that's the word. But we had, everything was put into the Christian context, but I would mention that this is Ramadan. And fasting has been a tradition in all religions. I think one of the things that I think is that I am a Christian and I want to be the best Christian I can be. I want to follow Jesus as well as I can. And I embrace others who are following their ways to God and help them to grow in their faith as much as they can. And I tend to, I always emphasize the commonalities. We are all human beings trying to figure out how to live a good life. And it takes many forms, as we all know, from knowing each other.
I think sometimes we want faith to be certainty, and it's curiosity.
There's the question of faith is not, it's well known.
I guess my first thought about this is being called to places you do not want to go. And going.
Yeah. Darn it. Chris, I waved the microphone at you and didn't give it to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris. I'm the diocesan intern here. I am curious. I'm also not a cradle Episcopalian, and one of the things that drew me to the Episcopal Church was how material everything was, how we carried literally a cross in and out of the service. And I'm curious, to anyone, as you see the cross come in that procession, as you see it come out, what kinds of things come through your mind, like spiritually, that image of literally following a cross in and out of our church services? How does that sort of land? The fact that you, even in this room, you know, you look around and there are just hundreds of crosses, you can't miss them.
Like the window?
In the windows, on the stole. How does the visual, I guess, in worship kind of land in the conversation?
Were you gonna? Okay. I mean, I think it's a multivalent. I think for some people, if you're just enculturated to it, you don't think about it at all. We had a cross break. A guest acolyte accidentally dropped one, and the back of it split, and the metalsmith was like, "It can never be repaired. It's been repaired too many times. Cannot be repaired." And we were exploring what would it be to have a Jerusalem cross, and which is what's carved on the front of the altar. And in the thinking around it, there was a surfacing of, while that might mean one thing to one group of people, for another that meant, so it meant brutality and violence for Jesus and for God's Son, but then the particular expressions of the different crosses have different meanings. And so for some parishioners said, you know, I wouldn't want to come into church behind a Crusader's cross, because that meant a kind of violence and disrespect and power over another group to which I don't ascribe. I think of it as like an invitation to a way and a path to the altar to be nourished, and then very clearly back out into the world where the life of faith is, what's been consumed is metabolized as we move through the week, and hopefully come back again the next week.
We are actually creeping up on the end of the
Yes.
hour. As
I
you
must
might know,
redress.
the formation hour is not a full hour. We could continue this conversation a long time, but following up on what you just said about following the cross out into the world, it is not just here. Next week, we will have a presentation by the recipients of our new seed fund. You may not be familiar with it, but the church, a committee, helped distribute a sizable amount of money to someone who is going to do something new in the community. And we will learn more about that. I think you said in your sermon this morning, which I didn't actually hear, I just heard people talking, that when we follow the cross, there is action involved. And so we can learn about some of the action that is taking place around us next week. But thank you all, and thank all of you.